Ever get that feeling like there's just this like built-in sense of right and wrong, like something that goes way beyond just like laws, or religious rules.
Hmm.
Well, that's kind of at the heart of natural law theory, and that's exactly what we're diving into today
Yeah.
with some help from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy.
Absolutely.
So get ready, folks, because we are about to unpack some pretty serious philosophical concepts.
Oh, it's a fascinating area, especially if you've got like a basic grasp, of ethics already.
Right.
We're going to really sort of dig into the nuances, the debates, and how this whole theory tries to tackle this massive question of where does morality come from?
So imagine like a universal code, right?
Hmm.
But it's not written down anywhere. It's like woven into the fabric of the universe itself.
Hmm.
That's natural law. But get this, there's a twist, two
Oh,
sides to this coin.
I'm intrigued. Lay it on me.
All right, so one side you've got the theological
Yep.
natural law is like this, it's part of God's plan, like this blueprint for everything.
Right.
But the other side, it's about us. It's about humans, you know?
Right, right.
Natural law is also like the compass of our reason, guiding us towards what's inherently good.
Yeah, it's like that inner sense of what should be.
Okay, but right away, doesn't this like bump heads with other viewpoints? Like what about people who are atheists or agnostic or think morality is like relative, just depends on your culture?
You're hitting on a crucial point right there. It definitely creates some tension there. Atheism, agnosticism, ethical relativism, they all kind of shake the foundation of this idea of natural law, right? I mean, they're saying if there's no God or if morality is just, like you said, a cultural construct,
Yeah.
then this idea of a universal objective code sort of falls apart, doesn't it?
It does seem like a pretty big challenge, right? So
Yeah.
let's say, just for the sake of argument, that there is this cosmic rule book out there.
Okay.
What's actually in it? Like, what does natural law tell us to do?
Well, the basic idea is pretty simple on the surface,
Yeah.
do good and avoid evil. But
Seems easy enough.
hold on. Defining good now, that's where things get a bit tricky.
Right, because good seems so subjective, right?
Absolutely.
Like, what I think is good could be totally different from what you think is good.
100%. And that's why natural law really stresses this idea of good before, right? It's not about just maximizing good like utilitarianism or sticking to strict rules like Kantianism.
Right.
First, you got to figure out what's inherently good, and then you can work out the rules, the right actions to get there.
To figure out the goal and then the path.
You got it. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, a big name in natural law.
Right.
He believed that things like life, knowledge, procreation, living in society, and rational behavior, these were all inherently good.
Hmm.
But it's not just about chasing these things blindly. How we pursue them matters too.
So even if, like, the goal is good, there could be right and wrong ways to get there.
Exactly.
So does that mean that some things are just always wrong no matter what?
Well, Aquinas definitely thought so. Actions like murder, lying, adultery, these were always violations of natural law, no exception.
Wow, no wiggle room there.
It's not for Aquinas. And this is where things get really interesting, you see, for us philosophers, because how do we even know what good is in the first place? Is it objective or subjective?
Right, that's what I was sort of getting at earlier. It does feel like good is kind of in the eye of the beholder, you know? How can natural law say it's universal if it's based on something so personal?
Well, that's where all these different schools of thought come in.
Okay.
You see one view, and this was championed by Thomas Hobbes.
Okay.
He said, good is subjective, it's just what we desire. But Hobbes, he also argued that all humans, we share this fundamental desire for self-preservation.
Right.
So that becomes the bedrock of his natural law.
Interesting. So even though good is subjective, there's this like common ground.
Yeah.
This universal desire we all have that could form the basis of a shared morality.
Exactly. But other philosophers have different takes. The Aristotelian view, for example, suggests that goodness comes from fulfilling our nature. Just like a flourishing oak tree is a good oak tree. A good human is one who lives according to their inherent human nature.
I like that analogy. So it's about reaching your full potential, being the best you can be.
Yeah.
Based on what it means to be human.
Right. And that idea is gaining a lot of traction with modern natural law thinkers.
So that's pretty different from just saying like whatever I want is good.
Yeah, for sure. And then you've got the Platonic view, which takes a more, metaphysical approach. Says good exists independently of us, as these perfect forms we're always striving towards.
Okay.
So it's not really about human needs or desires, but this higher objective standard.
All right. So we've got these different ways of defining good, but how do we actually know what's good? Like, is there some kind of natural law detector, we can
Oh, yeah.
use?
Uh-huh. That's another hot debate.
Right.
Some philosophers, the derivationists, they think we can figure out good by just deeply studying human nature, like scientific observation for morality. It's like dissecting human behavior to find the moral principles hidden within.
So by studying what humans do, we can work backward to figure out what they should do.
Exactly. But then there's another group, the inclinationists.
Okay.
They believe we're just naturally drawn to certain things like life knowledge connection.
Right.
And they say that pull, that yearning, that's our inner awareness of goodness.
So it's like our gut feeling, our intuition is pointing us toward what's good.
Yeah, something like that. And then some even suggest it's a social process, you know? Maybe this knowledge of natural law develops through history,
Okay.
through our social structures, through shared human practices.
So it's not just like a personal intuition, but like a collective understanding that emerges over time.
Right. It's a fascinating idea.
Yeah, okay, I'm starting to see how complex all of this is.
It definitely is.
But let's say we figure out what good means.
Mm-hmm.
How do we go from there to actually knowing what to do, in a specific situation?
Yeah.
Like, how does natural law make that leap from knowing life is good to knowing don't murder?
Well, that's where the rubber meets the road, you know?
Right.
And it's where natural law faces some of its biggest challenges.
Yeah, it's a question that's kept philosophers busy, for centuries. How do we translate these big ideas about good, into concrete actions?
Yeah.
Moral rules we can actually live by.
Right, because it's one thing to say life is good, but it's a whole other thing to get to like, don't murder, you know?
Yeah.
How does natural law make that connection?
Well, there are a few different approaches within natural law theory.
Okay.
One idea is to find like this single overarching rule
Yeah.
into something like love thy neighbor and then derive all of the rules from that.
Ah, so it's like finding the master key that unlocks the whole ethical system.
Exactly. But others argue for like a more methodical approach,
Yeah. They say we need to develop like a test for rightness. You know, a way to ask, does this action respect that inherent goodness we've identified?
So it's more about evaluating each situation in light of those fundamental goods
Yeah.
rather than having this fixed set of rules.
Exactly. And then there's the virtue ethics approach,
Right.
which emphasizes the role of like wise individuals.
Okay.
These are people who, through experience and reflection, have developed, a really deep understanding of the good. They just see the rightness or wrongness of a situation, even when it's not obvious to others.
So it's less about following a strict code and more about cultivating moral wisdom.
Yeah.
Trusting the judgment of those who have like honed their ethical compass.
Precisely. But of course, natural law theory is not without its critics,
Right.
One of the big challenges they raise is, can it really account for all moral rules? Like, can it give us clear guidance on complex issues like stealing or environmental ethics?
Yeah, I can see where they're coming from.
Yeah.
It seems like natural law might be good at explaining those big universal no-nos. Right. But what about those gray areas? The
Yeah.
situations where it's not so clear what the right thing to do is.
That's a key criticism for sure. Some argue that natural law might tell us what's reasonable,
Okay.
but it doesn't necessarily tell us what's morally obligatory.
Okay.
In other words, it might help us understand why certain actions are generally good or bad,
Yeah.
but it might fall short when it comes to our actual moral duties.
So it might be a good guide for like living well, for flourishing,
Yeah.
but not necessarily a rule book for determining what we're morally required to do.
Right. And some critics go even further.
Mhm.
Saying good and right are completely separate categories.
Mm.
They argue that natural law can guide our rational choices,
Right.
but can't dictate what we're morally obligated to do.
Okay.
They say obligation requires like a social context,
Mm.
some kind of demand imposed on us by others.
So it's not enough to just recognize something as
Yeah.
good or reasonable.
Right.
There needs to be social pressure.
Yeah.
A sense of accountability for it to have real moral weight.
That's the argument. And this raises like a crucial question for natural law.
Yeah.
How does it establish its moral authority? If it's just about being reasonable, why should we feel obligated to follow it?
Exactly.
Who or what is enforcing these natural laws?
Right, because if there's no God backing it up,
Yeah.
where does that ought come from?
Mm.
Like, why should we do good and avoid evil?
That's where things get really interesting, you see.
Right.
How do natural law theorists respond to these challenges? One way is by kind of blurring the lines between morality and reason.
Okay.
They argue that being moral is being reasonable, making choices that align with our nature and the good.
So they're saying that following natural law isn't just about doing the right thing. It's about being the best, most rational version of ourselves.
Exactly. Another response is to say, okay, maybe there's a distinction between morality and reason,
Okay.
but natural law's account of reasonableness still captures the most important aspects of morality. In other words, even if there are other ways to think about moral obligation,
Yeah.
natural law still gets to the heart of what it means to be good.
So they're saying, look, even if our theory isn't perfect, it still offers a valuable framework for understanding and living a moral life.
Right. And then there's the more radical response,
Okay.
which is to say the whole concept of morally right is so messy and confusing
Mhm.
that we should just ditch it altogether and focus on what's reasonable.
Wow.
It's a pragmatic approach, you know? Let's worry less about abstract duties and more about making wise, practical choices.
So they're basically saying, let's cut through the philosophical jargon and focus on what really matters,
Right.
living a good life.
Precisely. And it's important to note that natural law theorists can draw on all of these arguments to defend their position.
Right.
It's not an either-or situation.
Right. They can mix and match depending on the specific challenge they're facing.
Exactly. But even if we grant all of that, there's still the question of specifics, you know? Can natural law theory really explain the whole spectrum of moral rules we encounter in everyday life?
Right.
It might be easy to see how it condemns murder.
Yeah.
But what about more nuanced issues like honesty, loyalty, or environmental responsibility?
That's where the rubber really meets the road, isn't it?
It is.
It's one thing to have these grand principles,
Right.
but can natural law actually provide concrete guidance on the messy, complex dilemmas we face in the real world?
That's the million-dollar question.
Yeah.
And it's where the debate is still very much alive.
It does feel like natural law theory is always being put to the test, like constantly challenged to prove it can handle, the complexities of modern ethical dilemmas.
Yeah, exactly. Critics want to see if it can go beyond just those obvious thou shalt nots, you know,
Right.
and offer some more nuanced explanations for like a wider range of moral rules. They're asking, can you really derive all of our moral obligations from this idea of inherent goodness?
So it's not enough to just say, well, murder is bad because it violates the natural order.
Right.
They want to know why certain things are good or bad
Yeah.
and how those judgments apply to like specific situations.
Right, and that's where things get really, really granular.
Yeah.
To truly assess natural law theory, you have to look at, specific examples, specific moral norms, and see if the theory can actually offer a satisfactory explanation. Like, for instance, how would natural law approach issues like animal rights or the ethics of AI? Can it provide a framework for thinking about these modern challenges?
It seems like those are the kinds of questions that keep philosophers up at night.
Oh, they definitely do. And it's important to remember that natural law theory isn't static.
Right.
It's not like a set of rules carved in stone.
Yeah.
Contemporary philosophers are constantly refining it, adapting it,
Right.
trying to apply its principles to this ever-evolving ethical landscape.
So it's not just some ancient philosophy gathering dust on a shelf.
No.
It's a living, breathing system of thought that's still being debated and developed today.
It's a very active area of inquiry.
This deep dive has really made me think about the foundations of morality in like a whole new way.
Hmm.
It's so easy to just take our moral beliefs for granted.
Yeah.
But natural law theory really forces us to ask, where do these beliefs come from? Are they objective and universal? Or are they just products of our culture and upbringing?
And that's the power of philosophical inquiry,
Right.
It challenges us to examine our assumptions, to dig deeper, to ask those fundamental questions about right and wrong, good and evil. It's not about providing like easy answers, but about giving us the tools to think critically and form our own conclusions.
As we wrap up this deep dive into natural law theory, what's the one key takeaway you'd want our listeners to ponder?
I think the most important thing is to recognize that ethics is an ongoing conversation,
Yeah.
It's not something we figure out once and for all.
Right.
Natural law theory offers a valuable framework for thinking about morality,
Okay.
but it's not the final word, It's a starting point, a springboard for further reflection and discussion. So as you navigate the complexities of your own life, keep those questions coming. Keep challenging those assumptions. Keep exploring the ideas that shape our understanding of right and wrong.
Well said. And on that note, we'll wrap up this episode of The Deep Dive. Thanks for joining us on this journey into the heart of natural law theory. We'll see you next time for another exploration of the big ideas that shape our world.